Hey, this is Sabrina Monarch bringing you the astrology forecast for September 16th to September 22nd. We are in the midst of Mars retrograde, and we have a new moon in Virgo this week at the start of the week, followed by the Sun entering Libra by the end of the week, and we have Mercury in Libra square Pluto. So before we get into it, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the notification bell so that you are aware of when new videos come out. I'm an evolutionary astrologer and a clairvoyant. I've been writing these forecasts at monarchastrology.com, where you can still find the written versions every week. I'm on my 6th year now, and I recently branched out to YouTube to bring you a video version as well. So I'm going to share my slides and get into it. So new moon in Virgo and intentional engagement. A new moon occurs in the later degrees of Virgo, 25 degrees. And at the end of the week, the sun will enter Libra. The lunation trines Jupiter, Pluto, and Saturn in Capricorn, are big, 3 planets. Not all physically big, but it's a big energy to have this lineup of Capricorn planets right now. And so Virgo, a new moon in Virgo, trine these planets, brings in this kind of cold, dry, pragmatic energy just before the sun enters a Venus-ruled sign Libra, which highlights connection and sociability. This energy, this transition from Virgo to Libra, has a similar energy to the inner work that we might do to be more intentional and aligned with our values, to make way for more fruitful and reciprocal connections with others. When we do personal development or work with our shadow, or truly claim our desires instead of putting them in shadow, which I think that this Mars retrograde is also really good for. When we do these things, we diminish the frequency at which we project these things onto other people, making things other people's responsibility or other people's fault, etc. And this enhances the quality of our connections. Inner work allows us to engage more intentionally with other people. Whether that is, inner work that we've done that allows us to be in relationship more deeply, or inner work that other people have done that allows us to connect with them more readily. And of course, your own inner work is what you have the most agency and responsibility over. Along these lines of Virgo's transition to Libra and a more conflict-prone sky because of Mars retrograde, and Mars is square Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto in Capricorn right now. I reflected on what intentional engagement means to me, so I have an example. By the way, if you want to learn more about Mars retrograde, you can check out last week's forecast, and I'm also going to leave a link to a webinar that just happened as I'm recording this. It just happened yesterday. Through Fresh Voices in Astrology. I was part of a panel on Mars retrograde, and you can still buy the recording, and it was so good. So many epiphanies for me just being on this panel. And if you want to learn more about what Mars retrograde is, that's a really good resource. So I'm leaving that in the notes. But here's an example around what I mean by intentional engagement. For some time, and I mean years, like as a pattern as a kid to early adulthood, I would become friends with people who had a good number of stories about how the things that had gone wrong in their lives were essentially other people's faults. I was the kind of person to believe and sympathize with them, see the underdog in them, and want to champion them like no one else had. Rescuer energy, my bad. When some time would pass and inevitably I became the next person who was at fault for something in their lives, I learned the pattern and learned discernment. When I meet someone whose interpersonal narrative continually centers them as the recipient of everyone else's wrongs, I relate with them differently than I would with someone who I perceive to be taking personal responsibility and accountability for themselves. I relate differently in a way that protects my energy because unnecessary conflict is exhausting. and is discerning about how I can or can't be available. Discernment is a Virgo keyword. Virgo is a highly independent sign. You may know it as the Virgin. And so it doesn't necessarily mean sexually chaste. It can also mean non-involvement, being one in oneself. It is a kind of independence that grants us capacity to be discerning about whether or not we choose involvement, which brings us to the next sign, Libra, which is all about relationship. There are ever more subtle threads of engagement and involvement, places where we feel hooked or compelled by more mysterious drives and motives that maybe we only vaguely sense or really are under the radar. Mercury in Libra squares Pluto and Capricorn this week, bringing a potential for sharp clarity in the mind around what subtle agreements that we're making. Like when we sacrifice our integrity to be liked, or we diminish our full expression to fit in, or any number of under the surface trades that we make to get something we feel like we need badly enough to even make those sacrifices. Going without that quick fix, whatever that need is, by disengaging and not having that need fulfilled immediately, can be a cold or dry experience. So why am I saying cold and dry? These are very key kind of Saturn words. We have the lunation, new moon in Virgo, trine Saturn, trine the Capricorn planets. And Virgo also has a little bit of a cold, dry energy. It's an earth sign. So energetically cold and dry. Think about what those terms mean to you, what that feels like to you. So going without this quick fix, kind of cold and dry, the ascetic or someone who's being disciplined, is also going without short-term gratification. It does make space, however, for something more aligned to enter our experience, something more resonant. Being involved, synergizing, and collaborating with others is truly a source of joy and fulfillment in this life. It's different, though, when it comes from a place of addiction or compulsion versus when it's a genuine choice. Not all choices are perfect either, right? But choosing 100% what these choices are allows us to be authors of our lives rather than victims. And when we do encounter consequences from our choices, as we do, because all choices have consequences, consequence is a neutral word, there's many different kinds of consequences. When we've made a choice 100%, when consequences accrue, we can also take responsibility for them and for how we'd like to readjust if we would like to. This week may have a way of bringing our attention to these subtle dynamics, these subtle trades of energy and choice making and involvement. But also there is some opportunity to imagine a new way or to rewrite the script. Becoming aware of a pattern often precedes rewriting it. So before we get into our week more, a few announcements. One is that getting on my mailing list is the best way to stay in touch with me. My astrology readings, my one-on-one readings are currently fully booked. I'm still taking clients for one-on-one mentorship, which is a 6-month or a 1-year commitment, learning about your natal chart over time, or deepening into it if you already have an astrology practice. And I help my mentorees with studying astrology, with developing their professional astrology practice, or moving toward various goals in their life, or working through various issues or conflicts or impasses using the wisdom of evolutionary astrology, as well as some other modalities that I use, such as visualization and thought work. So if you're interested in working with me in that capacity, you can send me an email at sabrina@monarchastrology.com. I'll also be announcing the next Evolutionary Astrology Intensive. We have one currently in session, but I'll be announcing when the next one is, and I'm aiming to have it to be friendlier to European time zones for those of you in Europe. And I'll be announcing that here, but also on my mailing list, which is why I suggest signing up and also getting these weekly forecasts delivered to you every week. And I think those are my announcements for now. So on September 17th, 2020, Mercury in 17 degrees of Libra will square Jupiter in 17 degrees of Capricorn. And then just a few minutes later, new moon in 25 degrees Virgo at 4 a.m. Pacific. And during this lunation, the sun and the moon will be square the nodes of the moon, or the nodal axis, which in evolutionary astrology, the nodes squaring the moon is a huge deal. It's actually one of the number one things that I pay attention to in chart readings, if there's planets squaring the nodes. So I took this into account when thinking about this week, of this kind of impasse between the nodes. And there's something called a resolution node, which is a little bit technical, so don't worry if you don't follow me. But when a planet squares the nodes, if you're looking at the chart, you start with the planet squaring the nodes and move in a clockwise direction. And the first node you hit is what's called a resolution node. So in this case, it happens to be the north node, which is already the node that we think of as like, go towards the north node. That's what's being developed. So there's something about the Gemini archetype that can help us this week. And I think of that a lot in terms of rewriting the script, working with cleverness and the magic of language to alter reality, spellcraft, spell work, and mundane spell work. You know, self-talk is a spell. How we tell stories, how we speak of our lives is a spell. So thinking about that with a little bit more lightness and craft and cleverness to create shift in our lives. Versus the Sagittarius South Node energy, which could be more dogmatic or more like a, this is my belief, especially because Jupiter, the ruler of the South Node in Sagittarius, is in Capricorn. It can be a sense of, this is the way it's always been, so it will always be this way. And that can be a story we have about ourselves. Like, I've always had this particular pattern in relationships and it's always going to be this way. Like that kind of jaded resignation. We want to move more toward lightness of the pen and picking up the pen and writing a new story in our minds, and maybe literally on paper, about how you feel about yourself and your opportunities in life. How you feel about the world, how you feel about the state of possibility in life. These are places that we have beliefs. These are places we can rewrite our beliefs. So this lunation will also oppose Neptune in Pisces, and the lunation itself trines Jupiter, Pluto, and Saturn in Capricorn. The new moon also forms an inconjunct to Mars retrograde in Aries, so there's a lot that this moon is aspecting. The upcoming full moon is October 1st, and by then the moon will be in Aries opposite the Libra sun and will form a tight conjunction to Chiron in Aries. So I always like to look ahead to the full moon for clarity on the new moon. So if we know that the full moon is going to involve a conjunction to Chiron, something about healing, something about our pain points is really up for this lunation, and it's going to be a seed moment for that will become, you know, something that we're aware of at the full. So Chiron is about healing. It's about healing these pain points that we have, or the places where we feel we have an impossible wound, something that can never be healed, which I think plays a lot into our mindset and the stories that we have about certain things in our life that we believe to be inflexible that may perhaps not be. So rewriting unconscious or self-limiting beliefs is so often emphasized in the personal development and the spiritual worlds. Since these beliefs really do inform how we move through our reality and what we think is possible for us, and therefore what opportunities we will take or initiate based on these beliefs, as well as how we will respond to events in our lives. And how we respond to events informs the consequences we create, and these consequences create more opportunities to respond and more consequences, and on the wheel of karma goes. So our beliefs are not only just cognitive things, but they are also karmic. They really, they're informed by our past and they write our future. So of course, beliefs seeing what they are and rewriting them is huge. With the South Node currently in Sagittarius, we all have the opportunity to recycle and surrender stale beliefs or stale karmas, if you want to look at it that way. The activities represented by the North Node in Gemini can help us do this: writing, speaking, working with logic. If we write or speak about what is going on in our consciousness, such as journaling or taking a voice note and re-listening to it, you have to, see or witness what you've just put out. When we do this, we're confronted with an actual transcript of our mental stories instead of just being inside of them. Once we have this transcript, we can ask questions like, what if this pattern that I keep replaying were different? Is there another way? I think, as someone who has been journaling my whole life, I look back on older journals and I'm always telling the same story. It cycles, I have this like evolution. So it's not exactly the same story, but the same core themes, the same patterns. And every now and then it gets boring. It's like, is there another way that I can respond to this? Like, can I create some change? And when I ask that question, I feel immense levity and opportunity come through, versus just being in that cycle of experiencing and lamenting the experience or whatever, to actually ask the question, could it be different? The new moon in Virgo can represent a new cycle of discernment around our mental scripts and our internal dialogue. Discernment as in even noticing what's happening or noticing micro shifts that we can make to change the story. Virgo is known for attention to detail and craft. Virgo possesses a faculty for sensing error and misalignment, so it can be then fixed and realigned. In overdrive or without a graceful context. So a graceful context is like believing that you're inherently good, or believing that the universe is good, or that God is good, or however you want to put that, that if you have a context that reality is fundamentally flawed or that you're fundamentally bad, then when you analyze your flaws, it's kind of like a never-ending hellish pit, right? Than if you had a more graceful context, just to put it lightly. So in overdrive, without this graceful context, Virgo's attention to craft can turn into excessive self-criticism and critique of others when projected outwardly. The operating question that leads to excessively self-critical answers goes something like, but what if I really am fundamentally bad? What if it's true that I'm inherently flawed? And the mind then scans for evidence. We can always liberate ourselves from the dogma of self-diminishment when we choose to stop believing in the thought of being bad in whatever way that shows up in our lives. It's not necessarily going to be that obvious, like I am bad, like you might not even think that way. It's the subtle kind of context or the hidden meaning of a thought that deduces down to that message. That's how it's sneaky. Virgo's conscientiousness and attention to craft can be reallocated towards something more life-enhancing or even productive, right? It's not productive to pick at ourselves all day to death. There's a different way to engage with the conscientiousness that Virgo represents. It can be helpful to think in story and narrative and context for this story. If we're living our best lives, external circumstances being whatever they are, a lot of spiritual work and a lot of, I think, personal strength and resilience comes from having an unconditional values. And so regardless of what's happening in your life or what's happening in the world, feeling into your inner pillar of strength to be able to connect with whatever frequency you want to connect with. It's not necessarily easy, but it is strength and resilience quite literally. So regardless of what's happening, let's say you're living your best life. How do you author in the details of that best life? Life becomes more of a craft and an authoring journey than it is about fixing something broken and, or some kind of improvement project. And improvement can still happen, but not from the masochistic context that it is necessary or else. There's a way, it's consider like when you want to improve how you feel in that moment. And if you are allowing yourself to deepen your craft or get better at something out of love, or if it's coming from a place of fear and anxiousness. It's interesting too, because it really comes down to a vibrational shift, because you can't beat yourself up for not being positive enough or like feel anxious that you're so anxious, right? Like at some point you just have to like take a breath and like let that anxious script go. Let that cortisol production simmer down, like it's a shift. It's not something that it's a choice and it's a practice. I think it's something that you can even imagine your way into. This is all just like a more wordy way of saying calm down, I feel like. But essentially, yes, like there's always something to be anxious about. The world runs on anxiety in a sense. Not completely, one layer of it certainly does. The sense of, are we on time? Is everything fit to standard? Did I eat enough? Am I going to live? Am I going to survive? Like all of that. And just that script never, its needs are never completely fulfilled, because there's always a new day, always a new mess, always more food that needs to be eaten, new things that need to be done. So it's detaching from the attachment. How would I say it? It's not being so attached to that anxiety and just letting it be. When we feel like we ever can arrive or that something can ever be perfect, if we just, finish everything, that's when we're on this motor of anxiety drive. And to get to that place where you're not run by anxiety and you still can get stuff done or still show up for life is this kind of Zen practice that is, again, a mindset. So all of the mutable signs, Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces, have this special connection with magic. The mutable signs shift easily, can be chameleon-like, are adaptable and fluid. One of Virgo's magical properties is detail and the way that altering details creates shifts in our lives. Many of us have a complex or strained relationship with detail. Details can be overlooked, they can be obsessed upon, they can be triggers for stress and overwhelm. But have you considered what it would be like to be in harmonic relationship with the details and the magic that they represent? Details each correspond with a ripple effect. When we change one small thing, we can create this huge impact. So, in what ways can you orient to details in a magical kind of seeing the opportunity or the grace potentials within them? It's not possible to be full blast Virgo in every single area of life. Just like it's not realistic to expect that every room of your house is clean, that every drawer is organized, that you are perfectly groomed and manicured, that your mind is clear, all your routines are on point, all your relationships are 100% thriving, all miscommunications cleared up, like perfection, perfection, perfection. It's not possible. The reality is that some areas of life gain more focus than others, and that there are always things that can be done. So Virgo can humble us to do our best, take one thing at a time, and focus more on the task at hand than we're focusing on everything that's not happening. Sometimes, though, to counter that, we do have to step back with Virgo and analyze what is it that we're avoiding? What are we distracting ourselves from? What are we procrastinating? These areas of life end up being pockets of energy where there's blockages occurring from neglect, and liberation can be found through tending. So one of the Virgo inactivities that I think of sometimes is having a list of the top things that you're avoiding and leaning into those and seeing what that does to clear obstacles in your life. It's the opposite of ease, I guess. It's like going into the gritty details. And when we find union and flow or Zen-like states through tasks that we undertake, we can greatly free our consciousness and begin to plant seeds in moment-to-moment moments, basic moments throughout the day, of these seeds that are harmonic rather than stress-driven. You're not trying to get anywhere because there's nowhere to get. You're just in tune with the details. The lunar cycle may be a beginning of a new relationship with detail and some healing of our self-concept in relationship to those details. Can you balance simultaneously the aspiration for striving, for more, for better, with a fundamental feeling of already being enough? And then later this day, the Sun in 25 degrees of Virgo will trine Saturn retrograde in 25 degrees of Capricorn. I didn't write about it additionally because we already covered a lot of its themes within the lunation itself. On September 20th, Mercury in 22 degrees of Libra will square Pluto retrograde in 22 degrees of Capricorn at 10:21 p.m. Pacific. So Mercury by itself is a light, or Mercury in Libra by itself is this kind of light, tactful, charming energy. We have the trickster, kind of clever mercurial energy in a sign that's ruled by Venus and is about grace and beauty and charisma. But Mercury square Pluto and opposite Mars, and this brings some teeth into the conversation potentially. I just got an image, when someone has a smile or something in a movie and there's that little kind of sparkle on their teeth, that except a thing with the sparkle on it is the image that comes to mind. So one way that Libra and Capricorn work together, for better or worse, is judgment. Together, they can keep a running scorecard of who is given and taken what. This dynamic does, in some sense, support and facilitate reciprocity in relationship through a distinct awareness of what is being exchanged, actually paying attention to those details. But it can go too far, or it can have a tit-for-tat kind of energy. However, Pluto relates to the unconscious and what's hidden, among other significations. We are not always totally aware of what we are giving and what we are receiving. So we might be giving something for a while of ourselves only to realize that we feel drained and we weren't totally conscious that we were overextending ourselves. Or we might receive something for some time and take it for granted or not even be aware that it is taxing someone else. And of course, that is their responsibility as well to not overgive, just as it's our responsibility to not overgive, but it's not always such a conscious thing. This can relate to exchanges that don't feel good for one or both parties, and therefore conflict from this lack of good feeling. And this conflict can simmer below the surface or emerge in argument or hurt feelings. And not that this can't be resolved, it totally can, but that's the conflict or the pressure. At a low level, this escalates into victim and persecutor dynamics. At a deeper level of personal accountability, however, we might consider what we think we are trading or exchanging in situations where we feel compromised. What did we think we were getting from the situation? if we are entering into situations transactionally or with hidden motives that we're not necessarily proud of, which can be hard to see sometimes, but they come up often through conflict. When things don't go a certain way, it gives us pause. What was I intending? What energy was I bringing into this? So let's say we're going into a situation transactionally or with motives that we're not so proud of. What is there to be surprised about when there's something problematic or fraught about the whole dynamic? We're entangled. We are part of the webs that we spin. And this type of thinking is not meant to excuse anyone nor throw blame at anyone. It's not about that. But to consider one's agency in disentangling from undesired dynamics and being more intentional about one's desires and needs. It's just the work of personal awareness, right? And being aware of what kinds of consequences our actions and words are accruing. And we're not always fully conscious of everything that we do, so we learn. When blame is not the instinctual response, when there's conflict, it's not about blame. So let's say that's been grown out of, or there's more personal accountability, whatever it is, then conversations around needs tend to be more collaborative, more mature, or more adult. Like, this is a conversation between adults. There's that sense of maturity being present. This transit can correspond with some deeper reflection about how we relate to our desires and how we ask for what we want or don't. So just as an example, like let's say that there's a desire for attention and this isn't fully claimed. A person's not fully owning their desire for attention. So they make scenes or get involved in drama unnecessarily for that attention, instead of just being upfront with themselves about their need for attention and finding another way to support that. There's any number of examples like that, of having this subterranean desire and getting it in some kind of way that isn't necessarily the best. So some deeper reflection about how we relate to our desires and how we ask for what we want or don't. Claiming our desires can be a powerful catalyst for deeper self-worth, better communication in relationships, and all over personal growth. Now that like fang with the sparkle on it feels cuter in that moment somehow to me. So this transit relates to some deeper reflection on the impact of our words and actions and how we balance the knowledge of our impact with changes in behavior. Whatever that is, there's so many different options for changes in behavior. It could be editing our own behavior to accommodate someone else, or disengaging from a relationship that is asking us to accommodate in a way that we don't feel is in integrity with us. There's so many different ways to adjust for impact. And that's very black and white in some sense of what I just said, of accommodate or just disengage, anywhere in between. This transit relates to, so when conflict emerges in relationships due to these hidden dynamics that we just explored, we can cycle through the drama itself, get so deep into the story of all the dramatic things that happened, or we can see through it to a bigger revelation or a bigger revolution in personal maturity. Typically with Pluto, it's pain that gets us to transform. It's the situation reaching this kind of boiling point that's intolerable, that makes us question our hidden motives and things like that. You don't have to let it get that bad, but there is that way that intense situations or intense dramas do spark reflection. And if we're not listening, if we don't listen to life, then things become, the knock at the door becomes louder and more intense. That's kind of just how it goes with Pluto. And again, it doesn't have to get that way if you tune into subtleties, but to each their own. So we're learning about the agreements we make and that we hold ourselves to, and potentially having breakthroughs in how we relate to our desires and our hidden desires. That was so intense, wasn't it? Always is when we're talking about Pluto. So September 22nd, 2020, the Sun enters Libra at 6:31 a.m. Pacific. Have the classic picture of scales with a feather and a heart. I have to re-up on the myth of that, of like something in the afterlife, of weighing the heart against a feather. So Libra season. In addition to charm, charisma, and interpersonal grace that Libra represents, we know this about Libra. Libra is also cultural grace, experiencing art, film, and music, and the pursuit of justice, whether in a broader political sense or a more local, communal, familial sense. Are things fair in our relationships? Are things fair in our communities? Are things fair in the world? These are questions that Libra asks. Spending quality time solo or with others during this season to enjoy art or the making of art would be a beautiful way to engage Libra. Beauty restores and energizes the heart and inspires us to look at the world in new ways. It is also balancing to spend time with art, as it offers some reprieve from normal life, mundane life, whatever you want to call it, and may change how we interact with normal everyday life in perhaps more inspired ways. So just as we need sleep in between waking, the mind entertains abstract concepts in between being present with what is tangibly there. And it is in that space of abstraction, such as considering or engaging with art, or considering what we value, or considering different options that we have, what we think is fair, what we think is beautiful. This informs how we interact with what is present. This would be a great season to reflect on what and who we want to be in relationship with, what energies. You can be in relationship with energies. It's fun. What kinds of people or who specifically that you want to be in relationship with. Libra is represented by the scales and is a sign that relates with negotiation and balance. Knowing where we stand or what we desire can help us make negotiations accordingly, instead of feeling swept away in another person's plans or in the passions of a moment. And being swept away isn't all bad. It can be wonderful, but not so much if it involves consistently compromising our values or not even knowing what our values are. Simply put, we have to know what we value and be willing to align with that, align our scales with that, even if that means saying no to something that is almost it, but isn't. In Libran experiences, these judgment calls are not always swift. They might be swift if we already know where we stand, but often if it's an evolution, it's a new decision. We spend time deliberating. A new decision or a decision that we haven't reached some kind of closure with. The plot line of Libra season could be this: deliberation. Since making decisions can be stressful and we may have many memories of decisions being stressful, I invite you to consider what decision-making looks like from a place of love rather than fear, or the heart that's as light as a feather. Consider dropping into your heart space and feeling into what right action would be for you, what it looks like from the heart. Consider acting in a way that is harmonic to your core values and to the integrity of your heart. And Libra season will intensify as the sun draws closer to the end of the sign, the later degrees of Libra, bringing the sun to form a T-square with the Capricorn planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto, and opposing Mars retrograde in Aries. At that point, the stakes may seem higher. They may be higher, but the heart will still be an important guide. So before it gets to that point of things heating up a little bit, warm up your heart by tuning into your heart space and thinking about your heart and dropping into your heart as you make decisions. It can be a really beautiful meditation to do heart breathing, like get into a meditative space, and like a normal meditation where you're thinking about like emptying the mind and just being a witness, and you return to your breath. Do that, but send your breath into your heart and keep focusing back on your heart. And once you are, sending all that breath to your heart space and feeling all that heart energy, you can utilize that heart opening space to consider things in your life. If you want to make a decision, feeling into what your heart has to say about it. And the more that you stretch that mind-heart muscle connection, the easier it is to access throughout the day in a moment-to-moment way. So this is what I have for you for the astrology. Go ahead and like this video, and do leave a comment. Let me know what resonated with you, how you're feeling, how you're doing. Sign up for my mailing list. I forgot to mention that there was no new episode of Magic of the Spheres, my podcast this week, but we do have a bunch of amazing episodes. So you can download that podcast on your podcast app of choice. And there's so many different amazing episodes to choose from. So I hope that you have a beautiful week. Thank you for being here. Like and share this video and comment, and I'll see you next time.